Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 40 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with me, Rory Lees-Oakes. And as always, my fellow traveller in the existential environment, Mr. Ken Kelly. How are you, Ken?
I'm exceptionally good, Rory. And the reason I'm so exceptionally good is there's a saying. It says life begins at 40. And I wonder if podcast episode life begins at 40 because we've hit 40. It's a mark, I guess.
It is. I think I'll have to break out a tea bag for that, Ken, for sure.
And it's going to be a value-packed episode today. We're going to be kicking off by looking at boundaries. Now, we've spoken about boundaries before, but we're also going to be looking at our personal boundaries. So we're going to be personalising this for you. Theory with Rory, it's another interesting one. We're going to be looking at object relations today. And you're going to be introducing us to Melanie Klein, Rory.
I am. I'm going to be introducing you to a Freudian theory, or some could argue a post-Freudian theory. She was after Freud. But it's an interesting idea of child development. And I'm going to just share a few reflections of how I see object relations theory in terms of my grandson, and a little bit about how I see the theory played out in his behaviour. He's only 7 months old at the time of this recording, but I think it's going to be a good link for people to be able to really understand what is a very, very wordy and complex theory, Ken.
Thank you. Looking forward to that being decoded, Rory. And then we're going to end off with a favourite of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. We're going to be speaking about diversity and difference. And it's a favourite because it comes around again and again in our Facebook group. If you're not a member of that, get yourself in there, and you'll find us by just going to Facebook and typing in Counselling Tutor. Come and join us. Knock on the door and we'll open it up and we will let you in. And diversity and difference is something you will certainly work with all of your career as a practicing counsellor and psychotherapist. So a very apt topic indeed. But right to the beginning, speaking about boundaries, and in counselling is about boundaries. When we first contract with that client, we're speaking about boundaries. But what about our personal boundaries, Rory?
I think it's really interesting, Ken. And this is something that Rachel Holly in our Facebook group has brought to our attention. So thank you for that, Rachel. A bit of a name check for you there. And she just starts off by saying, I'm just wondering if anybody struggles with boundaries in their personal lives. And I think the thing with counselling training is, I speak from my own frame of reference, my own experience, Ken, but I went through life with basically a pair of blinkers on. And then when I went to become a counsellor, the blinkers were removed. And now I'm really acutely aware of how people speak to me, what they say, how they put their stories of life together, and how sometimes certain things become clear. And I'll share an example with you. I was out in a social setting a few months ago, and I got talking to someone. We were just having a chat, and this person was telling me a little bit about their lives, and it wasn't a couch. Had no idea what I did for a living. It was just basically a social setting, and this person was telling me a little bit about their lives, and it became quite clear that she'd been abused as a child. And as a therapist, my antennas started to resonate. I felt myself tuning in, and you know what I did, Ken? I changed the channel, because I wasn't that person's therapist. She wasn't asking for therapy. We were there just talking about something else in a completely different forum. And that is an example of boundaries. There are some things which will come really crystal clear to you when you've trained and you've done the work a reasonable amount of time, and you have to make a choice whether you're the person, enjoying a cup of tea or a soft drink or a beer at a party, or the person who is permanently a therapist, and that is the road to utter disaster if you can't hit the off button.
Burnout. And it is unethical. It is unethical. Level 2, when we kind of start the counselling training journey here in the United Kingdom, one of the very first things we do is we define what counselling is. What is counselling? And counselling is a very specific relationship that happens at a certain place at a certain time, that is contracted, and it is for the good of the client. And it can be tempting. When you were saying that you were in that interaction with someone and you started resonating and the counsellor senses started tingling, that's a reference to Spider-Man, that is, Rory. It can sometimes seem rather seductive. Maybe when you're with a friend or something, maybe they do know what you do, and they may say, you're a counsellor, I wonder if you might give me a bit of advice. Boundaries, and these are your personal boundaries. You are not their counsellor. This is not a counselling relationship, and it can be tempting. It can be tempting to share what you know, but we have to keep out.
It can, and let me say that I'm going to go on record here. If you start to counsel someone and they're not contracted and they've not come for therapy, it's abusive. I'm going to make no bones about it, because you can open up all sorts of processes and you can leave someone in a very, very vulnerable state. And that is not what we're about as therapists, as a profession. And I'll quote from Spider-Man again, if I may, Ken, with great power comes great responsibility.
Ooh, I like it. Do like it. So we're talking about these personal boundaries, and yes, we can kind of see that when maybe a friend or a colleague or somebody starts speaking to us. But where else might we see these personal boundaries at play?
Well, I think, Ken, there's one where we may overshare. There's a term that's going around on social media at the moment. Certainly with younger people, YouTube, if you type in oversharing on YouTube, you will see loads of people, young people, sharing their lives, and they're doing it as a form of therapy. And, I'm not knocking them. If it works for them, it works for them, but that's on record. That is on record. Even if you take the YouTube channels off or the posts off, they can still be downloaded, still captured. They're in the internet forever. And I think we need to be very careful if we're sharing our own personal material.
Definitely.
And be thoughtful about why we're doing it. If somebody starts to tell me about their lives, and my first view is, why am I doing it? And if I find myself wanting to tell someone else about very intimate things in my life, my first little sign that comes into my mind is, why am I doing this? Yeah. And it could be transference.
Yeah.
Girlfriend transference. Again, it comes up again and again, that they remind you of someone. Or it could be that, you really need therapy and you're just offloading on people ad hoc. And I think that can be not really good for someone. I'm not saying that you can't share stuff with your friends, but, the person on the back of the bus or the train or someone at a party and you tell them your life story, I think that kind of leakage usually indicates that another form of help's needed. That's my view.
I like that. It's kind of selective transparency, isn't it? So we are being congruent and transparent, but selectively so, and keeping in mind that what you put out into that internet stays there forever, and it represents you way into the future, and you may not want to be represented that way. And we've definitely done a podcast episode really looking at the dangers of social media and oversharing. I like that because it's a term that is now. It's the here and now term that you're using there. One that came up for me is about confidentiality. You go into your counselling training and you go alone. You don't take your family with you. You don't take your spouse with you. You don't take your partner with you into training. And you develop and you start having a part of your life that you just can't share. And I'm only a few hours ago, I was at supervision, Rory. I was a bit grumpy before I went to supervision because there's a part of my life that I am not able to share with my wife. And we kind of vowed to share everything together. Since we've met. We've been together for nearly 17 years now, but I can't share my practice. I can't even talk to her about it. It's not something I can share. I can share with colleagues from time to time, but then selectively share without breaking confidentiality. So going to supervision for me was a big offload today. I was able to just let it all out, and that is boundaried.
Absolutely, Ken. And it's about being a healthy practitioner. So, the message I would give out, on this, it's about staying healthy. If people are leaking or projecting themselves all over the place, really, eventually that's going to end up in some difficulty, either an ethical difficulty where someone makes a complaint and says, hey, this guy's going around counselling everybody, whether they want it or not. Or alternatively, if you're oversharing, over too much leakage, then what can happen is you might find yourself compromised. So, as always, unpersonal therapy, supervision, reflection, personal journals.
Yep.
If you want to overshare, personal journals, then you can look back at it, as I have over the past, and gone, did I really? I'm not going to tell anybody that. Yes. did I really think that?
Oh, yes.
Because sometimes we can get just caught up in the moment, and it is about kind of looking after ourselves, and we deserve to look after ourselves.
Agreed. And looking after our clients as well by looking after ourselves. And one last final thought that I'd like to leave you with is to maybe consider recontracting with your partner, with your family. And we had an incident, we spoke about it in a recent podcast. You're out walking down the street with your family and a total stranger walks up and says, "Oh, hello." And you recognize them because they are a client of yours or were a client of yours. And you say hello and exchange that pleasantry and they move on. And then your family goes, "Who was that?" And you say, "I can't tell you."
Yes, and in that, there's a giveaway, really.
Well, I guess that's why I wanted to go to the contract with your family beforehand, that they know not to ask you.
Yeah, and funnily enough, I had this conversation with my wife, only yesterday, we just got talking in the car, and she said, "Do you ever see clients?" And I say, "I see them." It's like that thing from Seven, isn't it? I see dead people. I see clients, and all the time. And yeah, I do bump into clients more than my wife would know.
Yeah, because
she would never know who they are because I wouldn't tell her. But yeah, certainly when I worked in Ashton, which is near where I live, and I used to work at mine, I would regularly bump into clients. And not just clients from counselling. I was a support worker for a long time. I worked in mental health as a support worker for a long time. Regularly bump into clients. So there you go. And the other thing I would say is not outing colleagues when we're talking about boundaries and that. Not saying, "This is my friend Ken, and he's a therapist too," because Ken might not want the world to know what he does.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation, isn't it? Boundaries, and we work with boundaries all the time within our therapy room, but it's interesting to look at the boundaries within our own lives. And I always like to go back to the definition of a boundary, and it's a definition for me. A definition of a boundary is it is not movable. It is something that is placed in place, and when you get to it, it doesn't move. As soon as you have a flexible boundary, it is no longer a boundary. I don't know what it is, but boundaries by their very nature are not flexible. There may be times, and there are, of course, in therapy, when you will reach a boundary and that is clearly broken. Then you need to replace that boundary. It needs to be placed. It might be put in a different place, but boundaries don't move. They are not elastic. They are fixed.
Yeah. I mean, we could have a whole podcast on that, Ken. And maybe we will, but it's right. Boundaries are there for a reason. You're there to protect the client, and they're there to protect ourselves. And if we're not putting them in place, then we're not doing justice to either of those ideas, really.
Love it. Let's continue this conversation on the Facebook group. Jump in there because this is a conversation, like you say, Rory, we could go on. We could do the whole podcast just on boundaries. But we have to bring theory with Rory, and we're jumping into object relations. Object relations is interesting, Rory. Tell us a little bit of a taster of what we might expect today.
Yeah, well, object relations was an idea by Melanie Klein, and it's about how babies initially view the world, and basically it breaks down to what's good or bad. And in fact, she came up with an idea of the good breast and the bad breast. And I'm going to kind of explore that, metaphorically speaking, in the podcast, and discuss about how very young children start to regulate themselves. And although the theory may sound and is somewhat a little bit staid, because it was written a long time ago, it still has resonance today, and that's why we should never dismiss theories wholesale. So I'm going to explore that, and I'm also going to give you some examples of my observations of my grandson in terms of object relations to help kind of clarify what it looks like. The theory is one thing, but how it actually looks is something else, Cam.
Let's get straight into theory with Rory.
Counselling Theory with Rory Lees Oakes.
The other day, I was feeding my grandson some egg. He's being weaned at the moment, and we've been quite successful with the pureed vegetables, but we decided to try him with a little bit of egg. And, well, not to put too fine a point on it, I ended up with more egg over me than he ended up in himself. He spat it out. He didn't like the egg, and he cried a bit because clearly the egg wasn't for him. And it reminded me, as I was wiping the egg off my T-shirt, of a theory in psychology and psychotherapy called object relations. And it was developed and discussed and written about by a psychotherapist called Melanie Klein, who was a post-Freudian. In other words, she came after Freud. Now, where Freud and Klein kind of split away was that Freud believed that basically we were driven by sexual energy, which he called the libido, sexual aggressive energy, which is why Freud's theory is sometimes called drive theory, because we're driven by sexual drive. Klein, on the other hand, took the view that we were driven by object relations, and in particular, how we bonded with significant caregivers. So when we talk about object relations, the first real marker here is that we're talking about attachment. So let's just start off with what attachment theory is in object relations. Well, it refers to the relationship that a child has with their caregivers, but also the relationship a child has with themselves. So this is the key part of Kleinian theory. The relationship a child has with themselves is generated by the relationship they have with their caregivers. So in terms of my grandson having his egg, when he spat his egg out, his needs weren't being met. In other words, it was bad. Pureed vegetables good, egg bad. That's how he would have seen it. He spat it out, his needs weren't being met. Now, if I consistently didn't meet his needs, or his mum primarily didn't meet his needs, what would happen is that he would perceive things as good or bad. In other words, the experience of him being brought up and his experience of connecting with others would be split, it'd be fragmented. And what would happen is he would take on this split in himself. So let me just give you an example of that, how that works at a child level. My granddad is good because he feeds me when I'm hungry. So that's him seeing me as an object. So that's the relation he has with me as an object. The fact that granddad takes care of me and feeds me must mean that I'm good. So this is how the child feels. Yeah. And that's in relation to the object. So they feel loved. And then the other position is I love my granddad, and that's a representation of the relationship. And these relationships are formed by children with lots of different interactions. But central to the idea of object relations is a notion called splitting. And it's a mental separation of splitting objects or caregivers into good or bad. The child splits them into good or bad. And what will happen is that sometimes the child will repress aspects of themselves if they feel they're being bad. It's called splitting. So if the caregivers does not satisfactorily meet the infant's needs, the infant may take the bad side of it away and introject it into themselves. So if the child was consistently, if my grandson was consistently given egg and he didn't like it and he was told he was bad for not liking it, he doesn't have the intellectual capacity at 7 months to make a sense of the world intellectually. It's about stimulus. So what might very well happen is that he will think that he's bad for not liking the egg because I'm treating him that it's bad. And eventually what will happen is he would go through life thinking part of him is bad, fragmented. And actually what can happen is that children grow up to be adults and they're literally split about how they feel about themselves. They feel about themselves in very polarized terms, good and bad. And that feeling about themselves can be a lack of understanding or a lack of feeling about themselves. And sometimes it can lead to personality disorders. And I've spoken to people who've got things like borderline personality disorder, where they don't have any sense of who they are. They don't have any feelings or emotions connected with themselves. And that is because, according to the theory, they've split off as children. One of the other things that Klein contributed to significantly was the fact that putting children in foster homes as children for long periods of time almost certainly contributed to a deficit in their mental and emotional well-being, which is why modern social services now always try to find foster accommodation and foster parents for very small children who've been separated from their caregivers at birth, because very early interactions, they know if they're not satisfactory, the child will split and interject that side into them. The other interesting thing about Melanie Klein is that she had an idea of something called a good and a bad breast. And in terms of good and bad breast, again, it's the notion of splitting. The child gets sustenance from one breast and may not get the same sustenance from another. And as such, the child sees one breast as good, one breast as bad. They then feel that in the relationship with their mother, and also they feel it about themselves. And unless the caregiver acts to make sure they're getting the sustenance, that split becomes permanent in the child. And as a consequence, they carry it through the rest of their life, and it can affect their relationships. So that's object relations, how a child feels about others and themselves at a very early age.
Thank you very much for that, Rory. Informative as always. And of course, you can get the download for this episode of Rory's Theory. And if you've got any of Rory's Theory downloads, you're going to know the value of those. And the download for today is 5 observations on object relations. It really rhymes. You just got to have this. And you can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com. That's our mother website. From the homepage, just click on the podcast tab. You'll find that in the main menu. Go to podcast episode 40, that's 40, and you can download that from right within that page. Really an interesting bit of theory there, Rory.
It is, isn't it? And as I alluded to in the preamble, things like borderline personality disorder are very much a difficulty that some people struggle with, and that is due to the fact that they've not integrated the whole of themselves. So object relations still really has a relevance even in today's therapeutic world.
Excellent, thank you. So, moving on to diversity and difference, one of your favourites, Rory.
It is, and it's interesting because we have in this country the Equalities Act and protected characteristics. So the law in the UK says that we cannot discriminate against certain groups of people or certain individuals. So how do we transpose that into the therapy room? How do we make sure that we are working with difference? And it's amazing how many people struggle with this. I sat assignments for a number of years and people said, I treat everybody equally. And I said, there is the thing. It's laudable to come from that place of treating everybody equally, but sometimes we have to differentiate between people because of their diversity. Yeah. And that's okay. So, for instance, having a room that is accessible by a wheelchair. Yeah. Wheelchair access or a stair lift is a way of addressing a diverse issue. And also realizing, I think, that not everybody in the world has the same experience of life in terms of things like gender, or sex. I'm using that word male, female, because a woman's view of the world is far different. A woman's experience of the world is far different to a man's. And as a therapist, I've known this for a long, long time. And there's a really good book called The Second Sex by an author called de Bouvier, who puts this theory through, that actually men are seen as men and women are seen as only part of themselves, and part of how society views them. And it still resonates today. And Naomi Wolf's Beauty Myth is a really good book. You can pick it up on eBay really cheaply. And if you're a male therapist, you should read it, really should, because it gives you the idea of the amount of societal pressure that's put onto women to conform and look in a certain way. We're all worth it, Ken, apparently. So the advert tells us.
Definitely.
Yeah. And then sexuality. There can be a you often hear, I've heard it so many times, well, they will feel depressed because they're gays. And it's like, no. No. Just because someone is different to you doesn't naturally mean you could attribute the difficulty they're having to that. And that's something that we work through in training. We say just because someone is different, their skin colour may be different, their gender may be different, their sexuality may be different, their mobility may be different, their circumstances may be different, doesn't mean that automatically, because of that difference, then they're naturally going to be depressed. Because, of course, I am the finished model of normality. Therefore, anything else means that people are going to get depressed. I've heard that in training.
It's really interesting. What's interesting for me is, yes, we cover diversity, we cover difference in training, and it's interesting because we're looking maybe at different groups when we're talking about that, but the real work is in self. It is not outside of self. It is about your self-concept and how you view the world, Rory. So it's less about other people and more about the truths that we hold. And we don't choose those truths. Well, when I say truths, I'm doing this, you can't see this because you're listening to it on a podcast, but I'm putting in little inverted commas as I say these truths, because they are the beliefs that we hold as truths. But your family, the area you were brought up in, the color the color that you were born as, you are given truths as a baby that you cling on to as you go through life. And, we're challenged to examine and challenge and question those truths as therapists.
Yeah. And I used to do a super lesson, if I say so myself. I used to do a 4 corners lesson on diversity, and I used to put a piece of paper in 4 corners of the room. One piece of paper said what I read in the media. The other piece of paper in the other corner said what my family's told me. The other one is what I experienced myself, and the other one in the corner was knowing people of. And I would say, right, okay, in terms of diversity, where do you get your ideas from? And most people would troop to the media corner. Yeah. And I'd say, so everything written in the papers is true, is it? And they'd say, no, it's not. So I said, well, where else do you get your ideas from? And they would go to the parents, and they said, so where do they get their ideas from? Well, they might have got them from the papers. Yep. All right, okay. So where else can we get nearer to the truth? Well, we might have friends or people of different. So I want to be really careful here about not going down that route of I've got a black friend, I've got a gay friend, that tokenistic defence that some people throw up when they're clearly being homophobic or racist. I can't be racist. My friend's black. Right, okay. No, it doesn't work that way. The only way you can do is by investing time in understanding. Investing your time. Just because you've got a friend who may be of, a difference, and I'm even struggling with that word because it would say that it's different from the norm. It really is difficult. I would say you need to invest in understanding how their world is perceived by them. Because the world changes. And I will give you a really good example about some doors that I had fitted. My wife wanted some doors, internal doors, and she went to a shop that's no longer trading now, and not surprisingly. And she went 3 times to get some doors. And he said, I'll come next Tuesday. And never came, not Tuesday. And she wanted these particular doors, this is what she wanted. So we sat in the car outside the shop, and I said, you do know that if I go in and ask, they will turn up. And I said, I don't think we should be buying doors from these people because they're discounting you. They're not taking you seriously. I said, those are the doors I want. And she's willing to take the hit for the fact. And I went in and I said, those doors, can I have them next Tuesday? And the guy said, no problem. And you know what happened on Tuesday? He turned up.
Delivered the doors.
delivered the doors.
I think that says a lot about him and his frame of reference and his concept of self.
Exactly. When he'd finished and I paid him, I told him exactly what I thought.
Good for you. Good for you.
But that's an example of it, about how that's an example of discounting, not taking seriously, she can wait type of attitude. And that was the attitude, that definitely was.
Yeah, I hear you. And, you said the word difference. You said that kind of is a difficult word for you to say because it infers difference from the norm. And it fits okay with me, difference. And the reason it fits okay is because I believe that every single person is different. And they are their own unique individual. And I'm called on as a person-centered therapist to be as best I can in the frame of reference of another, to try and see it from their subjective reality. And it is the same, no matter who they are. They are all different from me because I've got my own subjective reality and I need to be in theirs. And it's about embracing that. And I think sometimes there's a fear. There's a bit of an eggshell situation where we don't know what to say and we don't know what to do and we don't want to say the wrong word and we don't want to offend. Again, those are just beliefs. We're people.
Yes.
We are people.
We are people. We're humans. And to quote Shakespeare from The Merchant of Venice, "Tickle me, do I not laugh? Prick me, do I not bleed? Poison me, do I not die?" And of course, that's a classic tale of the human condition. Merchant of Venice, of course, was Jewish, and he was making a point about, the persecution of the Jews. Shakespeare was very astute, but it's very, very true. Absolutely, absolutely true. And it's one that I always used to bring up when I was teaching. Bit of Shakespeare. Can't beat him.
Can't beat Shakespeare. What an episode. Episode 40, ending it with Shakespeare and relating it to difference and diversity. We kicked off today speaking about boundaries, not just boundaries within our counselling room, but our personal boundaries as we develop and train as counsellors. Of course, great theory from Rory with object relations and ending off as we just have with that Shakespearean quote brings us to the end of episode 40.
Absolutely. So don't forget to leave us a super message on iTunes. If you're on iTunes, give us a review. We love those reviews. They make our day. When we go in and we see someone's made another 5-star review, we go, yeah, great, it really is good. It really makes our day. Really, really kind of gives the organism itself a bit of a push, bit of a boost. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.